Ladies and gentlemen, the World Trade Centers Association General Assembly will start in 5 minutes. Please feel free to comment in the chat box. Also, please use the Q&A function for any questions. We will start the program shortly.
Good morning from New York, and welcome to the World Trade Centers Association 2021 General Assembly and Business Week. For the first time, fully virtual. We're gathering here with over 1,000 participants from more than 70 countries. I'm Robin van Pijnbroek, Executive Director of Business Development, and I will be your host. Now, today is the final day of our live stream speaker programming, and you can expect more thought-provoking speakers. We have also launched, and for the first time ever, our artificial intelligence-powered B2B matchmaking tool. I hope that you are fully exploring the functionality and are making the very most out of it. Registration for the tool are still open till Friday, and the B2B tool will be live for the next 2 weeks till May 14th. So there is still an opportunity for your business partners to sign up and explore the matchmaking. A brief reminder, there's a lot of activity going on the B2B platform, so please check if you have any open meeting requests to make sure you don't miss out on an opportunity. Now, before we start, just a few brief housekeeping items. There is a chat function. Do use it to communicate with other participants. There's also a Q&A function. You can field any questions there. There will be Q&A sessions with each of our guests. We will also be polling you, so do participate in the polls. And at the end of the day, there will be a survey. Please give us your feedback. It's important to us that we hear from you. And lastly, you will see a click next button that you will need to click on to go from one session to the next. Now, Our first keynote for today, live from Antwerp, Belgium, is Peter De Keyzer, founder and the managing partner of Growth Inc., and also former chief economist of BNP Paribas Fortis. He is an avid writer of editorials and books alike on creating growth and making sense of it all. He is therefore someone whose opinion is listened to in political circles. So Peter will provide us with an economic outlook and his views on growth opportunities in a post-COVID world. So Peter, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm handing it over right to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Robin, for the introduction. Also, thank you very much for everybody joining. I was asked to first give a brief introduction about the economic outlook, how as we see it, and then what's going on, and then Robin will ask me a couple of questions. I have 5 main points that I would like to tackle during the first bit of my presentation. So first of all, the economic outlook itself. We should not forget that this is the first pandemic since the early 20th century that we're going through. This is the worst economic shock since the Second World War. So let's say the scale on which this pandemic has ravaged the world economy is unprecedented. And thanks to huge policy stimulus, concerted action worldwide on behalf of fiscal authorities as well as monetary authorities, the damage has been, the bleeding has been stemmed to some extent. Central banks have lowered interest rates, have bought a lot of assets to provide liquidity. Governments, on their part, have provided a lot of relief for stricken populations, for companies, tax relief. There's been temporary unemployment programs. There's been stimulus programs. The ones that we're seeing right now in the US are truly massive. But let's say the true cost of the shock is still to be expected in the years going forward. There's threats as well as opportunities. Now, if you look at the way that the crisis was tackled, it's very interesting to see. For example, if you look at the forecast by the International Monetary Fund, if you look at their tables, a couple of weeks ago, they had their forecasts for 2021, 2022, but also the 2020 figures, and it's very instructive to look at those. If you look at 2020 figures as far as growth is concerned worldwide, every economy had a contraction of its economic activity. Whether you go to Brazil, whether it's Spain, whether it's France or the US, there was a contraction everywhere, apart from one exception, and that was China. China is the only economy worldwide that still had positive growth in 2020. Now, of course, this says a lot about the way they tackled the pandemic. And we know that the virus probably originated in China. China might have been relatively secretive about its origins in the beginning, costing us a lot of time in battling the pandemic in the rest of the world. But if you look at the problem that policymakers faced, and is that there was what we call an impossible trilemma. So you had to make a choice between economy, freedom, and health. Now, there's this other trilemma that a lot of you will probably know, which is fast, good, and cheap. It's a trilemma which is known in marketing. If you want something fast and good, it won't be cheap. If you want something fast and cheap, it won't be good. If you want something good and cheap, it won't be fast. And so the same goes for the tackling of the pandemic. You had to make a choice between freedom, the economy, and the health of your population. Now, let's say China clearly chose for its economy and health, which meant they wanted to get the pandemic under control as fast as possible. They wanted to safeguard the economy as good as they could, but this went at the expense of freedom. There's no freedom, no privacy, no freedom of movement. And so that allowed the Chinese to get the pandemic under control quite fast. Now, this is, of course, an approach that wouldn't work in most Western countries. But let's say the flip side of the medal is that because they chose to restrict freedom and to only go for the economy and health, they were about the first ones to actually get the pandemic under control. Look at a country like the US or Sweden. There, the choice was for the economy as well as freedom. So people, so the wearing of mouth masks is still compulsory in Sweden. In the US, a lot of states tried to keep their economies open for as long as possible. So choosing from a lot of freedom, they tried to keep the economy open, but this went at the expense of health. So the health outcomes were clearly worse in these countries. And then you have Europe, in which we said we want to fight the pandemic, and keep people's freedoms intact as much as possible. So freedom of movement, no big tracking devices, no scans when you go on the when you cross borders, etc. But of course, that went at the expense of the economy. So those were the choices that had to be made. Now, from a PR perspective, the fact that China was one of the only economies in the world that had positive growth, whereas the rest was in contraction, for them, this is a huge PR boost, basically. Now, that is what has happened. Now, as far as the recovery is concerned, we clearly see that in the US, the stimulus plans are massive. A lot of other countries don't have the same room for maneuver. In Europe, we are doing some stimulus, but it's not to the extent that we're seeing in the US. The good thing is that the stimulus program in the US is so big that we will see spillover to the rest of the world. So the fact that the US starts ordering windmills, infrastructure spending, et cetera, will have a beneficial impact on the rest of the world. Now, one clear danger that I see, and that's especially in Europe from the current pandemic, is a zombification of the economy, and the same might apply to the US as well. In that, you see, this was the worst year for the economy in a couple of generations, yet bankruptcies actually fell in 2020 because governments gave stimulus, because there was let's say a delay or a grace period when it comes to foreclosures. So the risk that you're running is that you have companies which are insolvent, which are being kept alive by government or central bank liquidity, and you risk ending up in a situation in which you have companies with a dead business model. Think airlines, maybe. Think cruise operators. Think hotels. Think cafes, restaurants, etc. But that still are alive. I mean, I mean, like the monster Frankenstein. I mean, the thing was dead in itself, but if you pour enough stimulants into it, I mean, it walks around, but it doesn't change the fact that underlying it's dead. And so that's a clear issue going forward. I mean, Japan knows what it is to have a zombified economy after the crisis, early 1990s. So that is a crucial one to be looking out for. Then, what you see right now is that the world is at the crossroads. Never before has global cooperation been more necessary and more needed than today. You see that when it comes to vaccination, when it comes to travel restrictions, when it comes to making sure that we don't have new variations of the virus ending up in all places of the world, we need global cooperation more than ever. But what we're seeing is vaccine nationalism. We're seeing countries choosing their own vaccine, countries not cooperating with each other, emerging markets, developing markets basically being left to their own devices. And this is going to cost us dearly in future. So we need cooperation, yet at the same point in time, we see more nationalism emerging. It's too early to tell which of the two will actually win. And then finally, what you're also seeing is increased tensions east-west. Look at the tensions between China and the US. Look at the tensions between Russia and the US and parts of the West. So that is maybe a threat potentially in the short to medium run. But I also see a lot of opportunities. We've seen an enormous boost of digitalization over the past year, out of necessity, because the pandemic forced us to use digital much more than we did. So if we keep on pursuing this, the world economy could actually become much stronger, increase its earnings potential because of that. And finally, let's say climate change, something for which we need coordination, cooperation internationally. Climate change has become much more prominent on the agenda. So governments need a pretext to spend right now. We need stimulus. We need to get the economy going again. And let's say climate change and global cooperation could be the ideal way of getting out of this crisis. So summarizing, we've had crises in the past, and usually mankind has surmounted these. In the 1930s, the Great Depression, we've had the New Deal of Roosevelt. After the Second World War, we had the Marshall Program in Europe and the Reconstruction in Europe. We had the fall of the Berlin Wall, led to the accession of Central and Eastern Europe to the rest of the European Union. This is our Second World War. This is our big moment in which we have to act. And I think that having such a big crisis, having the opportunity to do something for a longer term goal, climate change, I think that is for me the way forward, and that should yield us sustainable growth for the years to come.
Well, thank you, Peter. I mean, so much food for thought, and we will dig into all of this deeper. A lot of the issues that you raised, actually, we've been talking about yesterday as well. So for questions, please put them in the Q&A box. We will also have a poll up, so please make sure to vote. And here are 3 questions. One is, how confident are you in a positive economic outlook for 2021? Second question is, should businesses take a more active role as change makers in society? And this third question we just added, coming off what you were saying, Peter, is about this trilemma. Make a choice: economy, freedom, or health. Very interesting to see what the audience has to say about that. Now, first question here, Peter, like you mentioned growth in China, right? And you all mentioned the zombification in Europe and these enormous, the Frankenstein company. So the elephant in the room, you also alluded to, it's the trade tensions, the tensions. And at the core of that is of course, the US-China relationship, which is, let's say, frosty at best right now, really undermining global stability. So where does the European Union, the EU, come in all of this? As a major trading bloc, can it actually also act politically? And do you still see the EU as a power broker, or just being sidelined by the US-China economic and geopolitical duopoly, basically?
Europe is basically one of the most open economies in the world. So if you look at Europe as one big economy, there's hardly a single economy in the world which is more open, which is more dependent on exports and imports, which means that it's in our own self-interest to make sure the world stays open. Now, in the past, let's say the past 20, 25 years, we've lived in the era of globalization. So it was normal to open up your borders, to have as low tariffs as possible, to have as many countries as possible in the World Trade Organization, et cetera, et cetera. But you're seeing this nationalism coming to the fore. And I do think what you're seeing is that I have a feeling that we're going towards maybe what we could call a new Cold War, in which basically your ideological affiliation determines who you trade with. We traded with China, we traded with all kinds of regimes. We didn't trade with the Soviet Union in the 70s and the 80s. So right now you see that this increased tension between the US and China, a bit less between Europe and China, could transform itself into, let's say, a new Cold War, in which we only trade with countries who also believe in freedom of speech, who also believe in civil rights, et cetera, automatically making two blocks. So Europe could be a broker, as far as that's concerned, to make sure it doesn't become a world in which everybody retreats on its own island, and it's in Europe's own best interest to make sure that it doesn't come that far.
Yeah, we clearly see these two value blocks arising, and also all over the world, countries are sort of taking sides, if you like. So we've discussed trade a lot, and yesterday focused on the international trade system. You mentioned the WTO. So is the current trade infrastructure adequate actually to deal with today's challenges?
Not really, I think, because what you see is that you see a first glimpse of, let's say, the value-oriented trade policy in Europe's idea that has been floated a number of times and probably become reality in having a border CO2 tax, which means we've outsourced a lot of our industries to, let's say, developing markets or emerging markets. And so we lose a lot of CO2 emissions in Europe because we don't have these polluting factories anymore. But let's say now we import the production from places where maybe regard for CO2 emissions is even less. So on a planetary scale, we might have even emitted more CO2. So what Europe is trying to do is say, well, our own industry has invested so much in CO2 reduction, yet it is getting competition from companies or from the other side of the world that don't look at all at CO2. So Europe says we want to compensate for this. And if you are importing from China towards Europe, will slap a CO2 tax on you. And so you see this kind of, let's say, soft protectionism, climate change flavored protectionism. I don't think that the WTO or the international trading system is really taking this into account enough. So this will be the main challenge, because you want borders to stay open as much as possible, yet you also want to be able to tackle long-term climate challenges, and I think both will have to be reconciled.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so you're also a big advocate for the private sector. So how do you see companies as agents of change versus governments?
Well, the reason why we see companies as the main agents of change is that you see that politics has run into a number of obstacles. In the United States, you see polarization in a number of countries. You see strongmen or authoritarian movements rising. In Europe, we're good at making plans, but a bit less good at executing them. And why we believe that companies are the true agents of change is that they have a lot of stakeholders. They're quite close to these stakeholders, whether it's consumers, whether it's shareholders, whether it's clients, whether it's employees, civil society. And so companies are very well in touch with what's happening on a societal level. And so companies can make up their mind much more quickly than politics can. And once they've decided on something, they can implement it much faster, and it has an effect on a much larger amount of the population. I mean, just imagine that that McDonald's or Burger King say, okay, we're going to scrap all supersized menus, whatever. Just giving an example. If they do that and say, this is our contribution to battling the global obesity pandemic, they will have an effect tomorrow on the lives of millions of people. Just imagine you would have to assemble a global political or governance alternative to achieving the same end. I mean, a company is a true agent of change. And one important other reason is companies have the eternal life. So a company in a going concern mode has to assume it'll still be around in 10, 20, 30, 40 years. So a company that is well led should have an idea of how they're going to contribute to this world of 10, 20, 30 years out. And so that's the main difference as far as I'm concerned. And I think companies know much better. They face the scrutiny of clients and consumers. They face the scrutiny of suppliers, of politics and civil society. So they're much more in tune with what society wants than maybe a politician who gets elected every 4 or 5 years and is less able to push through big reforms.
I think it's an extremely interesting proposition here, and I want to sort of take that to your most recent writing, where you do mention, we talked about this before you coming on the program here, that power is silver and influence is gold, right? So can you elaborate a little more on your thinking here?
Yeah, so the whole idea is, if you want to change the world, there are 3 ways of trying to achieve that. I mean, one is violence. The other one is power, and the last one is influence. Now, violence is always temporary, and sooner or later your adversary will use it against you, and then you're on the losing end. So that's a zero-sum game. Power is something that is attributed to you, and you get it. I mean, you're an elected official, you're a secretary of state, I mean, you're a president, whatever, but it's temporary. Influence has a legacy which is much, much longer. Influence is the power of an idea. You know that in the movie Inception, the character who's played by Leonardo DiCaprio says, an idea is the world's most infectious disease. Once you plant it in somebody's head, it actually spreads. And ideas build cities. Ideas change societies, change the world. And so influence is all about ideas. So the thing we write as dedication to everybody who we give the book to is tell your story, gain influence, change the world. You see that somebody like Jesus Christ or Muhammad or whatever still has influence today, centuries after their death. Whereas recent systems that were in power, Soviet Union, etc., have no influence whatsoever. You often see that they don't combine. Al Gore had a lot of power when he was vice president, but he had little influence. It was only when he didn't have power anymore that he became influential when it concerns the climate. So I do think that influence is the way for companies to show that they're the agents of change.
Yeah. It's still all about the power of an idea. Totally agree with that. So we've all living through this COVID pandemic for the past year, and I'm just curious to get your take on where this whole crisis and all the changes, the digitalization we're seeing, where this will cause a more lasting and disruptive impact on society, and mainly on how we live our lives, how we conduct our business. So what will have fundamentally changed, you think, after this year?
What I do think will be a very important one, what will change after this year, is that everything which has to do with gathering large amounts of people in certain places, that will take some time to come back. I think that's for sure. This is something that's going to be long lasting. I think personally that the mouth mask will be the last thing that we actually abandon. This will take some time. Digitalization, business travel, I think that won't come back anytime soon in its previous form. When you see other people, it'll be for much more qualitative meetings. It'll be brainstorming. It'll be about creativity. But let's say just flying to another city to see somebody for an hour, exchange thoughts, and knowing you could have done that from a Zoom call or Teams call or whatever, I think that is forever behind us. And finally, I do hope that international cooperation gets a renewed boost from this that pandemic. If there's one thing that we learned, is that we need global coordination to battle this pandemic. And you see, in Europe, it happens pretty okay. We have, let's say, a constant way of negotiating with each other, being at the same table, discussing measures, etc., etc. And I do think that if we would have to take one thing from this, is that we're all in this together. And so the pandemic has shown that we cannot fight this alone. We need coordination, and we have to take this home for our next big challenge, which is climate change. And we need globalization. We need cooperation for that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's dig a little deeper on climate change. You think that the fact that the US now is back at the negotiating table, you think that's a game changer, or are we still in a very hopeless situation here?
I do think that's a game changer. I mean that as far as Joe Biden is concerned, the impression we have from Europe is that he was under-promising and over-delivering, and that's clearly the fact. If you read the articles in the Financial Times about the green boom or the green investments that are taking place in the US, it's huge. So I think for the past couple of years, Europe was clearly ahead as far as clean tech is concerned, and relative to the US. But right now, it looks as though the US is quickly overtaking Europe. So Europe will have to do its best to make sure that they can keep up. And I do think that when it comes to these tensions between East and West, as far as trade is concerned, there's one good thing that could come from it. And I make the analogy with the previous Cold War. We didn't trade with the Soviet Union. We didn't travel to the Soviet Union. We despised each other's ideologies. But one good thing that came out of it was the space race. The space race was, let's say, an ideological, scientific battle between both models to demonstrate who was a superior model. And of course, the US were the first to go to the moon, and then the Russians had the first man in space, etc., etc. Right now, let's assume we get these two blocks again, and we get climate technology and clean tech to be actually the way in which you want to demonstrate that our model is best at tackling this. A free model, liberal, democratic societies in which the best ideas pop up, or let's say a centrally planned, guided economy that can actually tackle any challenge. And I think it would be a good thing to have an increased rivalry, and that might get us faster to, let's say, a CO2 neutral world than anything else.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating development, and just going back to your point, Peter, about the role of business here. If you just look at the space race, and how private companies have actually taken over launching satellites, and what this idea is now, like, we're going to Mars. So I think we probably will see a lot of energy in sort of the development of these grand ideas. I do really, we have a lot of other questions in from the audience here, and I'm trying to go through. One of the questions is, just briefly, your opinion on countries and all their financial stimulus programs. Like, does it really make sense? And is any country have actually a good program, a good solid stimulus program, without putting the country into a zombie state?
I think it's always the difficulty of trying to weigh up, let's say, the short-term benefits to the long-term benefit. And short-term, you want to save everybody. There's a pandemic. I mean, everything's going to pieces. Support everybody. But longer-term, you only have to support those which are viable in the long run. I mean, there were companies that were almost bankrupt before the crisis. The question is whether we should keep supporting them at all. Take airlines. I mean, there's not a single sector in Europe that has gotten more money than the airlines. You could question yourself whether, from a climate change perspective, pouring billions into that sector is the best choice. There hasn't been a single, or maybe it was one, airline company in Europe that went bankrupt in a year in which their turnover fell by 95%. Now, that is not normal. So sooner or later, we should catch up with that. Anything that has to do with reskilling people, retooling economies, going for green energy, going for sustainability, going for low carbon emissions, going for isolating homes, these kinds of things, protection against floods, that's the kind of things we desperately need. And that's the kind of investment we do need. If you want to spend money, make sure it boosts your potential to grow. It boosts your sustainable potential to grow. That would be, for me, the yardstick by which to measure any stimulus program.
Yeah. Yeah, on stimulus, we have a lot of questions here about money supply and of course, inflation. So that's the $1 million question. Do you see fiscal policies tightening next year and thereafter?
Absolutely not. So I do think that there's going to be stimulus for a very long time to come. As far as central banks are concerned, I don't expect any any restrictions or any tightening anytime soon. The reason being that central banks have painted themselves into a corner. So by lowering interest rates all the time, debt has been increasing all the time. If you look at, there's one graph which really struck me, which was in the International Monetary Fund's World Economic Outlook, which shows debt, public debt in historical perspective and interest rates. Public debt is at an all-time high. It's even higher than it was at the end of the Second World War, whereas interest rates are at an all-time low. Now, central banks have lowered interest rates, telling markets and telling governments, these low interest rates should allow you to reduce your debt. And what have they done? They've said, debt has become cheaper. Let's take on more debt. Yeah. And so it's impossible for central banks to increase debt because then everybody who would be indebted would go bankrupt. So interest rates will stay extremely low for the foreseeable future. We run the risk of seeing a zombification of the economy. But if we're smart, we use these low interest rates, the fact that money is for free, to make investments that are actually worthwhile, boost our growth potential in the longer run. Let's not forget a lot of people in the hospitality sector will lose their job. I mean, restaurants, hotels, events, etc. They should be retrained, reskilled for other sectors. So my advice would be, don't try to protect every job, but do protect every person behind the job. And that's a clear difference.
Mm-hmm. Well said. So thank you, Peter. I just want to go back to our poll and sort of see what we've got back here. Question one was, how confident are you in a positive economic outlook for this year? About 70% is very confident, 65% is right in the middle somewhat, and 17% is also not confident at all. So there seems to be moderate to moderate confidence in the outlook for this year. Here, I think on your triangle question, which one would you choose as the most important? An overwhelming 82% chooses health, 7% economy, and 10% freedom. So I think it's still interesting that it's not 100% of choice for health. So I think that's very interesting. And then, should business take a more active role as change makers in society? I think everybody should then read your book, Peter, because 96% says yes. So good. Peter, thank you so much for being here with us today. I greatly appreciate you sharing your perspectives with our global audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Good. We will now move on to the next session of today's program, Disruption and Innovation in Real Estate. So again, please click on the next button to go to the next session, and we'll see you back momentarily.